Welcome back, my dear traveler. Tonight we journey deep into the complete history of the Elves of Middle-earth, those ancient immortal beings who walked beneath stars before the sun had ever risen, who built kingdoms of unsurpassable beauty, who loved and lost and endured across ages so vast that the very shape of the world was changed around them. This is a story that stretches from the very first moment of elvish waking at the shores of a starlit lake, all the way to the slow and sorrowful fading of their kind as the Third Age drew to its close and the ships sailed west into the forever darkened sea. It is a long story and a beautiful one, and there is no better time to hear it than right now, in the quiet hours when the world outside has grown still and the darkness beyond your window is soft and full of possibility. So I want you, dear traveler, to find the most comfortable position you can. Perhaps you are already lying down, your pillow cool and smooth beneath your cheek. Perhaps you are tucked beneath a blanket that carries just the right weight, that gentle pressure that feels like the world itself is holding you. Take a slow, deep breath now. Breathe in through your nose, hold it for just a moment and let it go. Feel your shoulders drop. Feel the tension at the edges of your jaw begin to soften. You do not need to hold anything tightly tonight. You do not need to solve anything or remember anything. All you need to do is listen and let this ancient story carry you somewhere far away and long ago, somewhere so distant that your own worries cannot follow. Imagine, if you will, that you are standing at the edge of a great lake. The water is utterly still. The sky above you is filled with stars. Not the stars you know, but older stars, brighter, more numerous, burning with a cold and glorious fire in a sky that has never yet seen a sunrise. There is no moon. There never has been. The world is young and dark, and the darkness is not frightening. It is the darkness of deep peace, of something not yet begun, of a breath held just before the first word of a beautiful song. The air around you smells of water and new earth, and the green of moss just beginning to grow on old stone, and the surface of the lake before you is perfectly, impossibly still, like a mirror laid upon the ground to reflect all those ancient stars. This is Cuiviénen, the water of awakening, and it is here that our story begins. Before we go further into this long and lovely tale, I want you, my weary listener, to do something small and simple. Reach out and leave a comment telling me where you are in the world tonight and what time it is where you are. I love to imagine all of you settling in from every corner of the earth, every time zone, every season, each of you finding a moment of stillness in the middle of your own life. It means a great deal to me. Now, settle back in, close your eyes if you haven't already, and let us begin at the very beginning. In the lore of Tolkien's world, before time had a name, before the sun or moon had been made, the great Ainur, those angelic powers who had been present at the creation of the universe, shaped the world according to a vast and intricate music. This music was the blueprint of all that would ever be, a cosmic song in which every theme and counter-theme was woven by Ilúvatar, the One, the Creator above all. The world that resulted from this music was called Arda, and it was meant to be a place of great beauty, a vessel prepared for the coming of the children of Ilúvatar, elves and men who were not the creations of the Ainur but the direct gift of Ilúvatar himself. The elves came first in the reckoning of things, though the great powers could not know exactly when or where they would wake. And so when the stars of Varda, that most beloved of the Valar, the Queen of Stars, whose works the elves would always cherish above any other gift, when those stars were freshly kindled and blazing in the new sky, in the still, dark hour between no name and no name, the first elves open their eyes. Picture that moment, dear traveler. Picture it slowly, the way sleep itself comes slowly, image by image, 60 figures, for that is the number tradition gives us, though of course the word 60 is perhaps more symbolic than literal. 60 beings lying in the soft earth at the water's edge, and then, one by one, stirring, eyes opening. The first thing they would have seen was the reflection of stars in the water. And then, looking up, the stars themselves, not learned, not taught, but suddenly, miraculously present, thinking, feeling, already capable of wonder. The elves were the firstborn, and they were already beautiful from the first moment of their existence, as if beauty was simply what they were made of at the most fundamental level. They called themselves the Quendi, those who speak with voices, because speech was one of the first and most profound gifts that distinguished them. They began to speak almost immediately, to name things, to call to one another and to the world around them. The stars they named, the water they named, the darkness and the wind they named. Language sprang from them like water from a spring, natural and unstoppable, and this love of words and song and the precise naming of things would remain with the elves forever, one of their most defining characteristics across all the long ages of their existence. But they were not alone in the dark world. There was one among the Valar who had not gone to dwell in the blessed realm of Valinor in the west, Melkor, the greatest of the Ainur, who had corrupted himself through pride and the desire for power, who had sown discord into the very music of creation and bent parts of it to his own dark purposes. Melkor had been roaming the world since its shaping, and when he became aware that the firstborn had awakened at Cuiviénen, he came to them, or rather, he sent creatures to them, shadows, spies, distorted beings that stalked at the edges of the firelight. And some elves who wandered too far from the water's edge were captured, never to be seen again. What Melkor did with those captured elves, dear listener, is one of the darkest and most terrible secrets in all of Tolkien's mythology. The whispered answer, implied rather than stated, is that he bred from them, through torment and corruption and the slow destruction of everything noble in their nature, the first orcs. That the orcs who would plague Middle-earth across all 3 ages of the world were made from elves, from the firstborn, the most beautiful of Ilúvatar's children, is a horror of the most profound kind. It means that every orc that ever marched beneath a dark banner or snarled in a lightless tunnel was, in some terrible, distant sense, a cousin, corrupted past all recognition, ground down into something barely capable of the thought and feeling they had once possessed, but descended from those first bright awakened beings. The elves themselves suspected this in later ages, and it filled them with grief. But that is later. We are still at Cuiviénen, and the stars are still above the water, and the elves are still young and new and full of joy. It was the great Valar Orome, the huntsman, the lord of forests and wild creatures, whose horn could shake the hills, who first came to the elves from the west. He did not come in secret or in shadow. He came riding on his great horse Nahar, who shone like silver in the dark, and the thundering of hooves and the call of his great horn Valaroma rang through the night like a wave of warm light, like the sound of something vast and benevolent announcing itself. And some of the elves fled, afraid, for they had learned already that things in the dark could mean them harm. But others stayed, and looked, and saw Orome looking back at them with love and wonder, for he had sought them, and finding them was a joy to him beyond words. Orome named the elves. He called them the Eldar, the people of the stars, and he went among them and brought word to the other Valar in the west that the firstborn had come at last, and the Valar debated what should be done, for the world was dangerous, and Melkor was still at large, and the elves at Cuiviénen were vulnerable and unprotected. The decision they reached was monumental, one of the great turning points of the earliest age of the world. They decided to go to war against Melkor, to overthrow him, and to invite the elves to come to the blessed realm, to the safety and splendor of Valinor, where the light of the 2 trees still filled the air with gold and silver in ceaseless alternation. The war against Melkor, though we call that earliest period the years of the lamps, and the conflict that followed it part of the long, turbulent years of the trees, was a mighty thing. The Valar moved against Melkor's stronghold of Utumno in the far north, where he had built his power and his dungeons, and after a great battle they broke it and captured Melkor and dragged him in chains to Valinor, where he was imprisoned for 3 ages of the world. The world itself was broken somewhat by that battle, its symmetry disturbed, its seas reshaped, but Melkor was contained, at least for a time, and the way was made somewhat safer for the elves. And then came the great journey, the invitation to travel from Cuiviénen to the west, to cross the vast wildernesses of Middle-earth, and come at last to Valinor, was extended to the elves, but it was not commanded, not compelled. It was an invitation, and the elves, even then, were not all of one mind. 3 great ambassadors were chosen from among the elves, one from each of the 3 great kindreds that had already begun to distinguish themselves in those early days by the shores of the lake. From the first kindred came Ingwar, who would become the High King of all elves. From the second came Finwë, who would become the king of the Noldor. And from the third came Elwë, who would become, in ways none of them yet suspected, one of the most legendary figures in all of elvish history. These 3 ambassadors went to Valinor, saw the light of the trees with their own eyes, felt the warmth of that golden and silver radiance on their faces, and came back utterly transformed, desperate to share what they had seen, eager to lead their people westward. But not all elves were willing to go, and this first great division is the taproot from which all the later divisions of elvish kind would grow. Those who agreed to make the journey were called the Eldar. The word Orome had given all of them, but now refined to mean specifically those who set out west. Those who refused to go, who stayed in Middle-earth, who never made the great crossing, were called the Avari, the unwilling. And the Avari fade somewhat from the primary narratives of Tolkien's mythology, not because they cease to exist, but because their stories are less recorded, less detailed, lived out in quiet corners of the world far from the great events that history would remember. The Eldar themselves then began the immense, slow, generations-spanning journey westward across Middle-earth. 3 great groups made the journey, though at different speeds and with different outcomes. The first group was the Vanya, led by Ingwë, the smallest and perhaps the most spiritually elevated of the kindreds, golden-haired, devoted to Manwë and Vardar, above all the Valar, singers of surpassing beauty. The second group was the Noldor, led by Finwë, the craftsmen, the makers, the deep thinkers, the elves whose love of knowledge and skill would make them the greatest artificers in the history of the world, and whose pride would eventually lead them into the most catastrophic choices ever made by any elf. The third and most numerous group was the Teleri, led by Elwë and his brother Olwë, the great mass of the elvish people, lovers of water and stars, and the open sky, who would eventually become the greatest mariners and shipbuilders the world has ever seen. Breathe slowly now, dear traveler. Let the story move at its own pace. We are walking westward with the elves, and the journey is long, through dark forests, and across great rivers, and beneath the cold brilliance of a starlit sky. The journey took many years. Some elves grew weary and turned aside, settling in pleasant places along the route. These became the various kindreds of Middle-earth elves who would still be present in the world during the Third Age. The Sylvan elves, the wood elves, those who never made it all the way to the sea. And then something happened to Elwë, something so strange and so beautiful that it would alter the entire course of elvish history. Walking alone through the forest of Nan Elmoth in East Beleriand, drawn by the sound of music in the dark woods, Elwë came upon Melian. She was a Maya, one of those lesser but still immensely powerful angelic beings who had come into the world to serve the Valar. She stood in the forest, and such was her beauty and the enchantment that surrounded her that Elwë simply stopped. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood there together, still, caught in each other's gaze, while time moved around them like water around 2 stones. And years passed. The forest grew up around them. His people searched for him and could not find him. Some of the Teleri waited and eventually moved on without him. He stood there, in the forest, holding Melian's hand for what might have been 100 years or more. When he and Melian finally moved again, when they came back to the world of action and decision, they were wed. And Elwë, now called Elu Thingol, the Grey Mantle, became the lord of all the elves who had remained in Beleriand, who had not crossed the sea, who waited for him, or who simply settled in that western land. They became the Sindar, the Grey Elves, and Beleriand became their land, and Melian's power became its protection, a great invisible barrier of mind and magic called the Girdle of Melian that enclosed the hidden forest kingdom of Doriath at its heart and kept it safe for thousands of years. Meanwhile, those Teleri who had continued westward eventually reached the great sea, the Sundering Sea, Belegar, and stood at its shore and looked out at the endless water and felt the wind coming off of it and heard its sound, and many of them fell in love with it immediately and profoundly, in that specifically elvish way of loving things that is total and permanent. The Vanir and the Noldor had already been ferried across the sea by Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, using an island as a vessel, the island Tol Eressëa. But a portion of the Teleri were still wandering, or had lingered too long, and they missed the passage. Some Teleri who found the shore stayed there on the beaches of Middle-earth for many years, learning the sea, building the first boats, becoming the first great sailors. Their lord Olwe eventually led them across in ships of their own making, ships of surpassing beauty, white as swan feathers. These Teleri settled on the island of Tol Eressëa at first, and then eventually moved to the shores of Valinor itself, building the great harbour city of Alqualonda, the Swan Haven, where their white ships rested in a harbour shaped like a crescent, and the sound of waves and elvish song mingled together always. And so, by the time the great migrations were complete, Valinor held 3 kindreds of elves: the Vanir on the slopes of Tanicatil beneath Manwë's halls, the Noldor in Tirion upon Tuna the Green Hill, and the Teleri in Alqualonda by the sea. And Middle-earth held the Sindar in Beleriand, and the Nandor in the forests east of the mountains, and the Avari in the further east, and various scattered kindreds, finding their own ways in a world still full of shadow. The Noldor in Valinor flourished in ways that are almost beyond imagining, under the light of the 2 trees, Telperion the Silver, whose light was cool and restful, and Lorellan the Gold, whose light was warm as noon in summer. They learned from the Vala themselves, from Aule the smith above all. Aule, whose love of making things was perhaps the closest thing in the divine realm to the Noldor's own deepest nature, taught them the craft of metals and gems, of stone and clay, of all the beautiful solid things of the physical world. And the Noldor took those lessons and built upon them until they surpassed even their teacher in the subtlety of their work. The greatest of the Noldorin craftsmen, and indeed the greatest craftsman of any elvish age, was Feanor. His name means spirit of fire, and everything about him burned with that intensity. His mind, his will, his love, his hatred. He was the eldest son of King Finwë, whose mother died giving him birth. For even elves could die under sufficient pain and grief, though they were naturally immortal. And Finwë had remarried, giving Feanor half-brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin, who were his equals in nobility, though never in brilliance. Feanor grew up surrounded by the light of the trees, educated by the greatest minds in Valinor, and he became something rare and dangerous, a genius with a temper. It was Feanor who first devised the Tengwar, the script, those elegant letters that became the primary writing system of the elves, and eventually of men as well, the letters carved into the west gate of Moria, the letters of the ring inscription. He simply invented them, in the way a genius of sufficient depth sometimes simply produces things that no one has thought of before, as if fishing them up from some deeper layer of reality where they were always waiting, and it was Feanor who made the Silmarils. Let me speak of these slowly, dear listener, because they deserve it. The Silmarils were 3 gems, 3 jewels, crafted from a substance Feanor alone knew how to make, a crystalline material he called silima, which could not be stained or broken by any mortal or ordinary force. Within each gem he imprisoned, and that word is strange, but let it stand, he imprisoned the light of the 2 trees themselves. Telperion and Lorelin both mingled together so that each Silmaril blazed with a light that was both silver and gold, both cool and warm, both restful and joyful, as if it contained within itself every good thing that light could ever be. And Varda hallowed them so that any unclean or evil thing that touched them would be burned. They were the greatest single feat of craftsmanship in the history of the world, and they were impossible to reproduce, because the light they contained, the pure, original light of the trees, could never be recaptured once lost, and they would be lost, but not yet. Feanor kept the Silmarils and loved them with the obsessive, consuming love of a maker for his greatest making. Even the Valar were not permitted to handle them. Even Finwë, his father, who loved him beyond all other things, could not always draw him out of the private world of his devotion to those 3 blazing gems. And Feanor's character, brilliant, passionate, fierce, prone to suspicion and quick to anger, began to curdle slightly in those years, as pride does when it has nothing left to prove. There was also Melkor to consider. The great enemy, imprisoned for 3 ages, had served his sentence and been released, for even the Valar hoped for his repentance, as the greatest powers will sometimes hope for things they cannot quite force. Melkor walked free in Valinor for a time, performing acts of goodwill, seeming chastened. But his very nature was corrupted beyond repair, and behind his apparent gentleness he was already scheming again, already whispering, already beginning the work of sowing discord. He went among the Noldor in particular, planting seeds of doubt and resentment. He whispered that the Valar had brought the elves to Valinor not out of love but out of fear. Fear that the elves, if left free in Middle-earth, would grow more powerful than the gods themselves. He whispered about Arda, the wider world, the kingdoms that might have been built there. He whispered about the men who were coming, the second children of Ilúvatar, who had not yet arrived on the stage of history, and suggested that the Valar planned to give Middle-earth to them while keeping the elves caged in Valinor. Most of these whispers were lies or distortions, but the best lies are made from fragments of something real. There was some truth in the idea that the world beyond Valinor held things of wonder. There was some real complexity in the relationship between elves and the Valar, and the Noldor, proud and brilliant and hungry for knowledge and achievement, were the most susceptible to Melkor's flattery. Feanor, ironically, was the one who most hated Melkor, who named him Morgoth, the black foe of the world, and refused to have anything to do with him. But the seeds Melkor had planted in Feanor's soul were perhaps the most potent of all, because they had fed his paranoia and his possessiveness until they grew enormous. Feanor came to believe that his half-brother Fingolfin was plotting against him, that the Valar were conspiring with Fingolfin to take his birthright, that the Silmarils were in danger, and in a confrontation that escalated quickly, Feanor drew a sword against his own half-brother in the streets of Tirion. This was a terrible act by the standards of the Elves of Valinor, who had lived peacefully for ages. It was unprecedented. Feanor was summoned before the Valar to answer for it, and he was punished, though the punishment by any measure was relatively light, by banishment from Tirion for a time. He went north to the fortress of Formenos, and Finwë went with him out of loyalty, and Feanor brought the Silmarils with him and locked them in a chamber of iron. And into this moment of tension and fracture came Morgoth, soft as smoke, with a final devastating act. He came to Valinor with Ungoliant, that great spider spirit, that drinker of light, that darkness given hunger and shape. Where she came from, not even Morgoth fully knew, but together they climbed the slopes of the mountain from which Manwë looked out upon the world, and they came to the 2 trees in the hour of their mingling, when the light was at its most beautiful, and Morgoth stabbed them both with a great spear, and Ungoliant drank their light, drank and drank and drank until the trees were hollow and withering and dark, and the whole of Valinor was plunged into a blackness that felt almost like the end of the world. In the same hour, Morgoth went north to Formenos and killed Finwë, the only elf in Valinor, who died in the First Age, killed at his own door by the most powerful being in the world, and took the Silmarils. The grief of the Noldor was incalculable. The grief of all Valinor was enormous. The trees were dying. Their last remaining light was gathered to make the sun and moon, the two lamps of the sky that would illuminate the world from that day forward. But the trees themselves could not be saved, and the living light that had filled Valinor was extinguished forever. That light now existed only in 3 places, the 3 Silmarils now stolen, now in the possession of the Black Enemy. Feanor stood before the Noldor in the darkness of Tirion, and he spoke, and what he said was the most consequential speech in the history of the elves. He spoke of pursuit, he spoke of vengeance, he spoke of going to Middle-earth, of following Morgoth, of taking back the Silmarils and never bowing to any master again, valor or otherwise. He spoke with such passion and such power and such blazing, consuming fire that the crowd roared with him. And then, in a moment so significant that Tolkien gave it a name, the oath of Feanor, he and his 7 sons swore by Ilúvatar himself, by the darkness before creation, and the light that came after, by all things holy and all things unholy, that they would pursue anyone who withheld or possessed a Silmaril to the ends of the earth, even to the halls of the dead, and make war upon them. Anyone who touched what was theirs, they would destroy. It was a terrible oath. It was the kind of oath that the universe takes seriously, that becomes a force in itself, that shapes not just the people who swear it, but the entire arc of history. And most of the Noldor, caught up in the passion of the moment, in their grief and their anger, and Feanor's overwhelming charisma, went with him. But first, to get ships to cross the sea, Feanor went to Alqualondë, to his kinsmen the Teleri, and asked for their ships. And the Teleri refused. Those ships were their own making, their pride and their joy, and they would not give them to a rebellion they had not chosen. And Feanor's people took the ships anyway. The kinslaying at Alqualondë was the first time elf raised hand against elf in mortal violence. The Teleri, who were armed with bows and the oars of their ships, fought back. Many died on both sides, but the Noldor were the greater fighters and the Teleri the less prepared. And in the end the ships were taken, and the harbour of the Swan Haven was red with elvish blood, and the age of innocence was over forever. A herald of the Valar came after them as they sailed and marched north along the coast of the Blessed Realm, and the herald pronounced upon them the doom of Mandos, sometimes called the doom of the Noldor or the Noldorlanter, the fall of the Noldor. It said that their oath would turn upon them and consume them, that they would know loss upon loss, sorrow upon sorrow, treachery within their own kindred, that those who remained in Valinor would not be able to help those who went to Middle-earth, that they would find no permanent victory, no lasting realm, no enduring kingdom, that everything they built would eventually fall. But if they turned back now, they might yet find pardon. Some turned back. Finarfin, the youngest son of Finwë, and many of his people turned back and returned to Valinor, weeping. Finarfin himself was pardoned and became the king of the remaining Noldor in Valinor. But his children, Finrod, Galadriel, Angrod, Egnor, went on. Fingolfin and his people went on, and Feanor and his sons and their people went on. And here occurred the second great crime of the exile. Feanor reached the coast of Middle-earth at the great bay called the Firth of Drengist, using the captured ships. He looked back at the mass of Noldor still on the far side of the sea, Fingolfin's people, those who had not his ships and not his sons to fill them, and he chose not to send the ships back. He ordered the ships burned, right there on the shore, in a great fire whose light was visible on both shores. The fleet of the Swan Haven was consumed, and Fingolfin and his people were left on the far side of the sea with no way across. They found a way, eventually. They crossed the Helcaraxë, the grinding ice, the frozen wastes between the far north of the world where the continents nearly met, in a crossing of such agonizing cold and treacherous footing that many died, and those who survived arrived in Middle-earth, hollow-eyed and hard, their childhood warmth burned away by the killing frost. And Fingolfin led them, and never faltered, and when they marched at last into Mithrim, their banners bright in the light of the new sun, for the sun had risen for the first time just as they arrived. A beautiful and terrible coincidence. Morgoth's forces were shaken by that light and fled from it, and the Noldor were in Middle-earth. Let the story rest a moment here, dear traveler. You are doing beautifully. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. The first great act of the elvish drama is complete, and what follows is both more terrible and more beautiful. The long age called the First Age, the age of the great elvish kingdoms in Beleriand, the age that the histories call the time of the greatest glory and the most profound sorrow. Beleriand, say the word softly. It was a land of surpassing beauty, a land of forests and rivers, of blue mountains and green plains, of hills and hidden valleys, of the western sea. And before the Noldor arrived, it was already home to the Sindar, those grey elves who had followed Thingol, who had lived there through the long starlit years before the sun rose. They had built a civilization of their own, slow and deep, rooted in the land itself. Their language, Sindarin, was different from the high elvish tongues of Valinor, more weathered, more musical, shaped by wind and water, rather than by the precision of lawmaking. Their greatest achievement was the hidden kingdom of Doriath, ruled by Thingol and Melian in the forest of Neldoreth and region where the girdle of Melian formed an invisible, impenetrable border that no enemy could pass without Melian's will. And there were also the Nandor, the elves who had turned aside during the great journey and settled in the forests of Osiriand in the far east of Beleriand, a land of 7 rivers, whose people were quieter than the Sindar, less warlike, more deeply given to the green world of growing things. Into this already complex landscape came the Noldor, glittering with the memories of Valinor, armed with weapons and knowledge the Sindar did not possess, burning with a purpose the Sindar could barely comprehend. The meeting of the two cultures was not entirely easy. There was pride on both sides, and misunderstanding and the fresh rawness of the Noldor's grief and rage. But there was also alliance, kinship, the recognition of shared nature, and gradually the great kingdoms of the First Age took shape. In the north, beneath the shadow of the Iron Mountains where Morgoth had retreated into his fortress of Angband, the Noldor built their ring of siege. For a long time, nearly 400 years, they managed to contain Morgoth, to hold him within his stronghold, to make Beleriand safe enough for beauty and learning to flourish. These were the long centuries of the siege of Angband, and in this time the great kingdoms grew and became magnificent. Fingolfin was the High King, and his seat was at Barad Eithel by the springs of Sirion. His son Fingon was a warrior of legendary courage. His daughter Aredel wandered the world with silver eyes and a restless spirit. His other son, Turgon, dreamed of a great hidden city. Feanor had died almost immediately upon landing in Middle-earth, killed in a rash assault on Morgoth's forces at the battle called the Dagor Nuin Gileath. He died in flames, literally, his body consumed by the fire of his own spirit, which had always burned too hot. His eldest son, Maedhros, was captured by Morgoth and hung by the wrist from a cliff of Thangorodrim, the great peaks above Angband, as a hostage and a taunt. And Fingon, his cousin, despite everything that had been done to his father's people, loved Maedhros enough to climb that cliff alone, with only his bow and his courage, and by a mercy of Manwë, an eagle, one of those great birds that served as the eyes and hands of the Lord of the Sky, managed to rescue him. They had to cut off Medros's hand to free him from the cliff's iron staple, but he lived, and he and Fingon cemented a bond between their houses that the burning of the ships might otherwise have permanently destroyed. Turgon's hidden city was a wonder. He received a vision from Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, was led to a secret valley ringed with mountains, the Vale of Tumladen, and there, following plans given to him in a dream, he built Gondolin. He took a great portion of the Noldor with him into that valley, and they raised Gondolin over many decades. White towers, broad squares paved with gleaming stone, fountains that sang in the wind, the great golden figure of the king's tower at its center. Gondolin was perhaps the most beautiful city ever built in Middle-earth, and because of Turgon's decree, it was the most secret. No one who entered could leave, no word could be sent out, no contact maintained with the outside world. It was a jewel in a sealed box, protected by its utter invisibility to the outside world, and it would remain hidden for nearly half of the First Age. In the south and center of Beleriand, the sons of Feanor held the eastern marches, their many towers and fortresses keeping watch on the passes through the mountains. Finrod, son of Finarfin, nephew of Feanor, the most beloved of the Noldorin princes by almost universal agreement, built Nargothrond, a great underground city on the banks of the river Narog. He had first come to Beleriand not via ship or ice, but by a path I have not described. But his story is so woven into what follows that we will come to it. Finrod was the most open-hearted of the Noldor, the most generous, the most willing to love the Sindar as his own people. And when men came at last into Beleriand, it was Finrod who was first among the Noldor to find them and to love them. Men, the second children of Ilúvatar. They arrived in Beleriand near the beginning of the First Age proper, wandering in small groups over the blue mountains from the east, mortal, short-lived, quick to passion and to change, utterly unlike the elves in their relationship to time and the world. The elves called them Atani, the second people, and their relationship was complex from the very first. There was fascination on both sides, and something like love, and sometimes real love, and also misunderstanding and occasional contempt, though the noblest elves never fell into that last. Finrod befriended the first men he met, the people of Beor, who became one of the three great houses of the Edain, with warmth and wonder, sitting with them at their fire and playing his harp and watching their faces as they heard music perhaps more beautiful than any they had ever imagined. The three houses of the Edain, the house of Beor, the house of Haleth, the house of Hador, each settled in different parts of Beleriand, each formed alliances with different elvish kingdoms, and each contributed in different ways to the story that was unfolding. The house of Hador, large and vigorous and golden-haired, allied most closely with Fingolfin's house. The house of Beor settled in Dorthonion, under the protection of Finrod. The people of Haleth, proud and independent, settled in the forest of Braithil, and kept more to themselves than the other two houses. But the long peace was always fragile, and Morgoth was always working beneath it. He was patient in the way that only the truly powerful can be patient, and he spent those centuries of siege building his armies, orcs and trolls and balrogs and worse things, his Dark Lord's mind arranging forces in the dark. And then, roughly 4.5 centuries after the Noldor's arrival, he struck. The battle that ended the siege of Angband was called the Daigor Bragolach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. Morgoth opened the earth before Angband and poured rivers of flame across the plain of Ardgalan, burning it to ash in a single night. In that fire and the assault that followed, the siege broke apart. Angrod and Egnor, sons of Finarfin, died. The holdings of the sons of Feanor in the east were overrun. Barahir, lord of Beor's people, saved Finrod's life in the rout, and Finrod swore an oath to him, a gentler oath than Feanor's, an oath of friendship and aid, and gave him a ring, the ring of Barahir, that would become an heirloom of the house of Beor, and eventually of the kings of men. Fingolfin, watching his kingdom fall, and his people die, and his lifelong work crumbling, rode in a fury of despair to the gates of Angband itself, and challenged Morgoth to single combat. It was the most astonishing act of courage, or perhaps of grief so great it had turned into something that looked like madness. in all the history of the elder days. Morgoth came forth, for even he could not refuse such a challenge without diminishing himself, and they fought before the gates of Angband, while all the armies watched, and Fingolfin wounded him 7 times, 7 wounds that Morgoth bore as scars forever after, marks of that encounter that never fully healed. But Morgoth was the greatest of all the Ainur in raw power, and in the end he pinned Fingolfin beneath his foot and killed him. And great eagles came and drove Morgoth back from the body, and Fingon came and buried his father on a cliff overlooking the land, and the wind from the sea moved over the grave, and the High King of the Noldor was gone. His son Fingon became the High King, and in the years that followed, the situation in Beleriand deteriorated steadily. Morgoth's forces pressed everywhere. The sons of Fëanor fought desperate rearguard actions. Nargothrond and Gondolin still held, secret and undetected, but the open kingdoms were shrinking, and into this world came the story of Beren and Luthien. Dear listener, breathe slowly here. This is the great love story of the elder days, and it deserves to be told with space and care. Beren was the son of Barahir, the man who had saved Finrod's life, who had received the ring of Barahir. After the disaster of the Dagor Bragolach, Barahir and a small band of outlaws held out in Dorthonion for years, and they were eventually betrayed and killed, and Beren alone survived. He crossed the terrible mountain range of Gorgoroth and the dark forests of Doriath's southern reaches, and somehow found his way through the girdle of Melian, the first anyone had done so without Melian's permission, because it was his fate to do so, and fate has a power even over the magic of the Maiar. He found his way into the forest of Neldoreth in the season of autumn, and there he saw Luthien Tinuviel dancing in a glade of hemlocks, and the world stopped. Luthien was the daughter of Thingol and Melian, half Maya, half elf, the most beautiful being ever to walk in Middle-earth, literally called the most beautiful of all the children of Ilúvatar in the histories. And Beren, in that moment, fell so completely and so irrevocably in love that when he spoke her name he could not speak anything else. He called out Tinuviel, nightingale, and she heard him, and did not flee immediately. But Thingol was not pleased. When Beren was brought before him, Thingol looked at this mortal man, ragged and alone, and felt an anger and a contempt that even his natural dignity could not entirely conceal. He set upon Beren a task that he believed was impossible, a bride price that no one could pay. Bring me a Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth. He meant it as a death sentence. He was wrong about it being impossible. Beren went to Nargothrond and claimed the aid of Finrod by the oath his father had sworn. Finrod gave up his kingship rather than betray that oath. His people chose to stay, led by the sons of Fëanor, who had long coveted Nargothrond's strength, and went with Beren and a small company. They were captured by Sauron, Morgoth's most powerful lieutenant, and imprisoned in his tower of Minas Tirith on the island of Tolin Garhoth. Sauron worked through them one by one, and Finrod sang against him in a contest of magical song, and for a time held. But Sauron's power was too great, and Finrod's companions were destroyed, and at last a werewolf came to the dungeon cell where Finrod and Beren were kept, and Finrod killed it with his bare hands and his teeth, and died from the wounds there in the dark, honoring his oath with his life. Luthien came. She came with Huan, the great hound of Valinor, who served Celegorm, one of Fëanor's sons, and who loved her and defied his master for her. Huan overthrew Sauron himself, and that is a remarkable thing, that the great hound overthrew the greatest servant of Morgoth in single combat. And Sauron's tower fell, and the prisoners were freed, and Beren and Luthien together went to Angband. This is the deepest into the darkness that any story of the First Age goes. They came to the gates of Angband, and Luthien threw a spell of sleep over the great wolf warden Drogluin, and the terrible wolf Karkaroth, who guarded the gate, and Beren disguised as one of Morgoth's werewolves they crept inside, and Luthien stood before Morgoth himself, before the black enemy, the most powerful of all the Ainur, in his own hall surrounded by all his power, and she danced and she sang, a song of such beauty and such magic that Morgoth was held, caught, drawn in, and then struck with enchanted sleep, even as he reached for her, and all his court slept with him. And in that impossible silence, Beren cut a silmaril from the iron crown with the knife angrist. They almost escaped cleanly, but Beren, overcome by the sight of those 3 blazing gems, tried to take another, and the knife snapped, and a shard of it struck Morgoth's cheek, and he stirred in his sleep. They ran. Carcharoth the wolf, the greatest wolf ever bred by Morgoth, awoke at the gate and was not overcome by Lúthien's power, for he had drunk an enchanted draught of Morgoth's own making. And when Beren held out the silmaril, Carcharoth bit off Beren's hand and swallowed the silmaril whole, and the holy light burned him from within, and he fled in madness into Beleriand. Beren and Lúthien were rescued again by eagles. Beren was brought before Thingol, and he raised the stump of his wrist and said that a silmaril was in his hand. For technically his hand was still out there, inside the wolf, and this is one of the great terrible jokes of the elder days. Thingol, who had somehow softened in all of this, who had come to see something in Beren that he had not expected to find in a mortal man, accepted the answer. Beren died from the wounds the wolf had given him, and Lúthien, who could not live without him, who simply refused to live without him, she too lay down and died, though death was not natural to her kind. She went to the halls of Mandos, where the dead wait, and she stood before Mandos himself, the doomsman of the Valar, the keeper of the dead, perhaps the most impassive and unchangeable of all the great powers. And she sang her grief to him, and he wept. It is recorded that it was the only time Mandos ever wept. And he brought her petition to Manwë, and Manwë to Ilúvatar. And Ilúvatar offered Lúthien a choice. She could go to Valinor and live as an elvish spirit among the Valar, without Beren, for he was mortal, and his spirit went to a different place entirely. Or she could return to Middle-earth as a mortal woman, giving up her immortality, living out a short human life alongside Beren, who would be restored to life for that same span. She chose mortality. She chose a mortal life with Beren over an immortal existence without him. And this is perhaps the most definitive statement in all of Tolkien's work about the nature of love, that the most beautiful being ever to walk in Middle-earth, half divine in her nature, freely chose to be mortal rather than be without the man she loved. They returned. They lived in the hidden land of Osiriand for some years, in a peace and joy that those who saw them long remembered. And eventually Beren was killed in the hunt for Carcharoth, the great hunt that Thingol led into the forests of Doriath to bring down that maddened wolf who died with the silmaril still burning in his belly. And Lúthien followed him not long after, fading as mortal women fade, and they passed from the world together. And the silmaril they had won came at last to Thingol, and was set by Celebrimbor in the great Noglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, and began the chain of grief that would eventually destroy Doriath itself. But that is still to come. The years after the Dagor Bragolach continued to be dark for the elvish kingdoms. There was a brief hope, the union of Maedhros, a great coalition of elves and men and dwarves that sought to strike back at Morgoth in one coordinated assault. The battle they fought was the Nirneath Arnoediad, the battle of unnumbered tears. Even by the standards of the First Age, this was catastrophic. The alliance was broken by treachery. The men of Ulfang, who had allied with Maedhros's eastern forces, betrayed them at the critical moment, turning on the Noldor in the midst of battle. The entire eastern wing of the elvish army collapsed. Fingon fell. The High King, brave Fingon, who had climbed the cliffs of Thangorodrim alone to rescue his cousin, he fell in the west, surrounded, overwhelmed, killed at last by the great Balrog Gothmog, lord of Balrogs. And Húrin, one of the greatest men of the age, was captured alive and brought to Morgoth, who set a curse upon him and upon everything he loved. The sons of Feanor retreated. The remnants of the great armies scattered. Beleriand was now largely under Morgoth's control or shadow, and only Gondolin and Nargothrond and Doriath still held against the darkness. The story of Húrin's curse moves through the remaining years of the First Age like a cold wind, touching everything it passes. His son Turin, who is in some ways the greatest warrior of men in the elder days, a being of extraordinary ability and extraordinary tragedy, was fostered in Doriath and loved by the elves there. But the curse of Morgoth moved with him, twisting everything. He killed an elf lord in a fit of misunderstanding and had to flee Doriath. He fell in with outlaws. He came to Nargothrond, where Finrod's successor, Orodreth, ruled and became a great captain. But his advice, well-intentioned, led to disaster. He refused to trust the wisdom of hiding, urged instead open war, and Glaurung, the great dragon, the first and greatest of the dragons, whose every word was a lie wrapped in another lie, came against Nargothrond with an overwhelming force, and Nargothrond fell, and Glaurung put a spell upon Turin's mind, causing him to forget his sister Nienor, to forget everything connected to his family, and wander on. Nienor herself was also caught by the dragon's gaze, and was stripped of all memory and language. They found each other, not knowing who the other was, fell in love, married. When Turin finally killed Glaurung in a desperate and heroic battle, the dragon's dying breath lifted the spell, and they both understood what had happened, and Nienor leaped from a cliff, and Turin fell upon his sword. The sword itself, the black blade Gurthang, spoke to him in his dying moment. There is something in this, something about the sentience of made things, the way the crafted objects of the elder days carried something of their maker's intent. The sword agreed to take his life. This is perhaps the darkest thread in the tapestry of the First Age. Tolkien meant it that way. The tale of Turin was his answer to the Norse sagas, his version of the great northern tragedies, deliberately shaped to carry that weight of doom and beauty and sorrow. And within the larger history of the elves, it serves as the illustration of what Morgoth's curse could do. How thoroughly the enemy could destroy a life even without touching it directly, simply by bending fate, by nudging events, by making the tragic outcome seem inevitable at every step. Let me carry you forward now, my dear listener. Let the tale of Turin sink into the river of time, and let the river carry us on to Gondolin, the secret city, the city that Morgoth could not find for nearly 500 years. Despite all his spies and his agents and his power, it endured because Turgon's law was absolute. No one left, no information was sent out, no contact was maintained. But fate and the complexity of the world eventually found a way in. The way in was Tuor, cousin of Turin, son of Huor, who had died at the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. Tuor came west, guided by Ulmo, the Lord of Waters, who sent word to him in visions and in the voice of rivers. And he found the hidden way into Gondolin, and came before Turgon. Turgon received him and loved him, and Tuor lived in Gondolin and married Idril, Turgon's daughter, one of the most beautiful of all the elvish women of that age. Their son was Erendil, and his name means lover of the sea, and he was the first half-elven, the first of that specific lineage that mixed the blood of the Eldar and the Edain, of immortal and mortal, in a way that would have enormous consequences for the world. Gondolin was betrayed by Meglin, Turgon's nephew, who had been captured by Morgoth, and revealed the city's location under torture, and the dark promise of Gondolin itself as a reward. And the assault came without warning. In the dark before dawn, a host of Balrogs and orcs and dragons pouring through the mountains, and the great hidden city fell in a night of flame and ruin that is called the Fall of Gondolin. And that was perhaps the single most devastating defeat of the entire First Age. Turgon died on the falling tower of the King's Hall. Many of the great lords and warriors of Gondolin died in that night, but Tuor and Idril and Erendil escaped, led by a refugee path that Idril had secretly prepared. One hidden tunnel through the mountains. Not even Meglin knew of it. And in the rearguard action that protected their escape, the warrior Glorfindel died in combat with a Balrog, falling together from a cliff into the void below. And great eagles came and retrieved his body, and he was counted ever after among the most honored of the fallen. The refugees came to the mouth of Sirion, to the havens, those scattered settlements of survivors at the delta of the great river, and settled there, and Tuor and Idril were with them, and their son Erendil grew up beside the sea, and Doriath had also fallen by this time. Fallen not to Morgoth, but to the dwarves, and then to the sons of Fëanor, in a chain of grief and greed sparked by that Silmaril in the Norglamir necklace that Thingol had so coveted. Thingol had been killed by dwarves over the necklace. Melian's girdle dissolved when her grief broke her. She returned to Valinor, and the forest of Doriath was left open to the world. And the surviving children of Doriath came to the havens of Sirion as well, and among them was Elwing, granddaughter of Beren and Luthien, who carried with her the Silmaril, for it had been recovered from the slain wolf, and then from the ruins of Doriath. Eärendil and Elwing wed, and Eärendil was consumed with the desire to sail west, to reach Valinor, to plead before the Valar on behalf of both elves and men, to beg for their aid against Morgoth in a war that the peoples of Middle-earth could not win alone. He built his ship Vingilot, the foam flower, and sailed again and again into the western sea, trying to find the way that was guarded against mortals, failing, returning. And while he was away on one of his voyages, the sons of Fëanor attacked the havens of Sirion, because Elwing had the Silmaril, and their oath compelled them. The havens were destroyed, but Elwing, rather than be taken, leaped with the Silmaril from a cliff into the sea, and Ulmo took pity on her and transformed her into a white bird, and she flew west over the water and found Eärendil's ship in the dark of the sea and came to him. And then, wearing the Silmaril upon his brow, Eärendil found the way to Valinor. He walked in Valinor, the first mortal ever to do so in living memory, and he came before the Valar, and he pleaded for both peoples, for elves and for men, and the Valar listened, and the great powers that had withdrawn from the world, that had left Middle-earth to its own struggles for so long, gathered their strength and came. The War of Wrath, the last great war of the First Age, was overwhelming. The Valar's host of Maiar and Vanyar and remaining Noldor swept over Morgoth's forces, and after a battle of enormous scale, Morgoth was defeated, captured, cast out through the door of night into the void beyond the world. And Beleriand itself, most of it, sank beneath the sea. The land drowned, the blue mountains and the forests of Neldoreth, the ruins of Nargothrond and the ash of Gondolin, the river Sirion, the havens, most of what had been the stage on which the greatest dramas of elvish history were played, all of it sank beneath the waves of the sea. Only a narrow strip of land remained, east of the Blue Mountains, and that became the western coast of the world that the Third Age would know. The First Age was over, and with it the age of the great elvish kingdoms of Middle-earth. Rest for a moment, my dear listener. You have traveled a long way already. Feel your breath slow, feel the weight of your body settle. The story goes on. There are 2 more ages to tell, and much beauty yet to find in them. But let this moment between the ages be a breath, a pause, a space in which the loss of Beleriand can be properly felt, because it was a loss unlike any other. Every great elvish kingdom of the First Age was gone. Gondolin, Nargothrond, Doriath, drowned or burned or ruined, the trees of Neldoreth, the fountains of Gondolin's white squares, the harbour of the Swanhaven, all of it beneath the sea. It is a loss that the elves who survived it carried with them forever. But the world continued. The Valar made a gift. Those elves who wished to come to Valinor could sail west and come to the Blessed Realm, to the island of Tol Eressëa or the shores of Valinor itself, and live there in peace. The great Noldorin lords who survived the War of Wrath, and there were not many, faced a question. Medros and Maglor, the last surviving sons of Fëanor, made one final terrible act in service of their oath. They crept into the camp of the Valar's host and stole the 2 remaining Silmarils. But the gems burned them, burned Medros's remaining hand, burned Maglor's hand in which he held his, for they were not worthy. And Medros, unable to bear it, cast himself and the Silmaril into a great chasm of fire in the earth. And Maglor wandered to the seashore and cast his Silmaril into the waves and wandered forever after along the coasts singing songs of grief, and some say he wanders still. 3 Silmarils, 1 in the sky, for Arundel was set to sail the heavens in Vingilot with the Silmaril on his brow, and he is the evening star, that bright point of light you can sometimes see just after sunset or just before dawn. 1 in the earth's fire, 1 in the sea's depths. And now for Arundel and Elwing, and for their sons, Elrond and Elros, the Valar made a decision of cosmic importance. Because they were half-elven, children of both mortal and immortal lineages, they were given a choice: to be counted as elves, immortal, bound to the fate of the firstborn, or to be counted as men, mortal, subject to the gift of Ilúvatar, whatever that meant. Elros chose to be mortal, and became the first king of the island realm of Númenor, and lived for 500 years, long even by the reckoning of men, but mortal. Elrond chose to be elvish, and he is immortal, and his story continues into the second and third ages, a thread of connection between all the ages of the world, the keeper of memory, the master of the refuge of Rivendell. The second age is in many ways a quieter age for the Elves of Middle-earth, though it contains within it events of the greatest consequence. Most of the great lords of the Noldor, Gil-galad, the last High King, Galadriel, who in her own way is perhaps the most complex and interesting of all the Noldor who returned to Middle-earth, Celeborn, the great lord of the Sindar who married Galadriel, Elrond, half-elven, keeper of records. These figures remained in Middle-earth and built what kingdoms they could in the lands east of the Blue Mountains along the western coasts. The elves of the Second Age settled principally in Lindon, the coastal land west of the Blue Mountains, where Gil-galad ruled as High King of the Noldor. There were also growing settlements further east, in the valleys and forests that would become the elvish lands of the later ages, and relations with the dwarves were renewed, specifically with the great dwarven kingdom of Khazad-dûm, Moria, in the Misty Mountains, whose dwarves were the Longbeards of Durin's line, the noblest of dwarven kind. The elves of Eregion, the land just west of the Misty Mountains called Hollin, established the greatest forge works of the Second Age and built a friendship with the dwarves of Moria that allowed trade and collaboration of remarkable fertility. The elves of Eregion, led by Celebrimbor, grandson of Feanor, the last and perhaps greatest of Feanor's craft line, were the ones who made the Rings of Power. This is the great story of the Second Age, and it begins with a deception so elegant and so terrible that it colors everything that follows. Sauron came to Eregion. He did not come as a dark lord. He was not yet widely known to be what he was, and in this age he had the ability to take a fair form and to seem what he wished to seem. He came as a herald, as an emissary, calling himself Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. He said he came from the Valar, bringing wisdom and knowledge. He offered to help the elvish smiths in their craft. Most of the great elves distrusted him. Gil-galad distrusted him. Galadriel distrusted him. They would not receive him. But Celebrimbor and the smiths of Eregion were exactly the right kind of elvish craftsmen to be seduced by what Sauron was offering. Knowledge, the expansion of their art, the possibility of making things of even greater subtlety and power than they had yet achieved. And so Sauron was welcomed into Eregion and worked with Celebrimbor for years, and slowly over those years passed on enough of his knowledge to set the smiths on the path to making the Rings of Power. The rings were made to preserve beauty, to slow the inevitable decay and diminishment of the mortal world, to give their bearers the power to maintain what they loved against the wearing of time. This was the elvish dream. They were creatures of great depth of love and longing for things as they were, and the passing of time was always painful to them. The changing of the world always felt like loss. The rings promised a kind of answer to that. And Celebrimbor and his smiths made 16 rings, and those rings were then further refined into the arrangement the histories record. 9 rings for mortal men who would desire power above all, 7 for the dwarven kings, and 3 for the elvish lords. But the 3 elven rings, Narya the ring of fire, Nenya the ring of water, and Vilya, the Ring of Air, were made without Sauron's direct participation. Celebrimbor made them alone, using what he had learned from working with Sauron, but applying it himself without the enemy's touch upon the metal. This is why the three remained somewhat outside Sauron's direct control, why they did not corrupt their bearers in the same way. Sauron, however, made his own ring. He went to the fires of Mount Doom, deep in his own territory of Mordor, and there he poured into the One Ring his own power and will and the essence of his domination. And when he put it on his finger, all the other rings became subject to it, bound to it, their bearers visible to him, and the elves felt it immediately. The moment the One Ring was made, they took off their rings and hid them, and Sauron knew that they had perceived him, and the pretense was over. What followed was the war of the elves and Sauron in the Second Age, a brutal conflict in which Sauron's forces overran Eregion and sacked it, and Celebrimbor was captured and tortured to reveal where the rings had been sent, and he revealed the 9 and the 7, but not the 3, and was killed and his body used as a banner by Sauron's army. It was a desecration of the worst kind, and the elves remembered it. The survivors of Eregion fled east into Moria, or north to Gil-galad's kingdom of Lindon. Among those who fled north was Elrond, who had been sent south with a small force by Gil-galad, and who in his retreat established a refuge in a valley in the misty mountains, the valley of Imladris, which men called Rivendell. This was not yet the last homely house of the Third Age, not yet the comfortable place of rest and lore that Frodo would find. It was a military camp, a refuge under siege, a desperately defended position. But it held, and Rivendell would endure. Sauron then turned to conquest of Middle-earth and made much of it subject to him. He would have taken all of it and might have succeeded had not the kings of Numenor intervened. For Numenor was at the height of its power then, that great island realm given to the men who had fought against Morgoth, the most powerful realm of men that ever existed, and their fleets came to Middle-earth, and their very presence was enough to make Sauron's forces flee from the coasts. But Sauron had a plan even for Numenor, and it worked, and Numenor was destroyed, a story of men, not primarily of elves, though the elvish friendly men called the Faithful survived it, and among them were Elendil and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, who came to Middle-earth and founded the kingdoms of Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south. The 3 rings of the elves had been distributed by Celebrimbor before his death. Narya went eventually to Círdan, the shipwright, the ancient Telerin lord, who had lived at the havens of Mithlond since the earliest days of the Second Age, and indeed much earlier than that. Nenya went to Galadriel, Vilya went to Gil-galad, and then to Elrond. And in the final years of the Second Age came the last alliance of elves and men. Sauron had come back from the Númenórean catastrophe changed, stripped of his fair form, unable ever again to take a shape that seemed beautiful, and he had made war on Gondor and taken the city of Minas Ithil, and Gil-galad and Elendil formed the last alliance, the greatest combined force of elves and men since the War of Wrath. They marched to Mordor. Elrond was there. It was a 7-year siege of the Black Land, ending with the final battle on the slopes of Mount Doom. Gil-galad died, Anarion died, Elendil fell. Isildur took his father's broken sword, Narsil, and used the hilt shard to cut the One Ring from Sauron's finger, and Sauron's physical form dissolved, and the alliance won. But Isildur kept the ring rather than casting it into the fire of Mount Doom, and that was the great failure of the Second Age, the moment when a simple act could have ended everything, when the world's long nightmare might have been finally resolved, and the moment passed. And so we come to the Third Age. The Third Age is perhaps the most familiar, dearest listener, for it is the age of the Lord of the Rings, the age most fully detailed in Tolkien's work. For the elves, it is an age of slow twilight, not of building and glory and great wars, or rather, not primarily of those things, but of tending what remains, of the gradual sense that their time in Middle-earth is drawing to its close. The power of the 3 rings holds their realms in a kind of preservation, a beautiful stasis, but it is the beauty of a flower pressed between the pages of a book, lovely and fixed, and not quite alive in the way a living flower is alive. The 3 great elvish realms of the Third Age are Rivendell, Lothlorien, and the Grey Havens, with a fourth important realm being Mirkwood, the woodland realm of Thranduil, a Sindarin king, the father of Legolas. Each of these places is distinct in character, each a different expression of what the elves had become by this late age. Rivendell, Imladris, is the house of Elrond. By the Third Age, it is everything its name implies when Tolkien calls it the last homely house, a place of rest, of healing, of lore. It sits in a deep valley, with waterfalls on three sides, and the sound of the river Bruinen always present, and the air of the valley is warmer than the mountains around it, and the light softer. Elrond has filled it with the accumulated knowledge of all the previous ages. He is the great keeper of records, the living memory of the world. He was there at the founding of Gondor, there at the fall of Khazad-dûm in the Second Age, there at events stretching back to the First Age itself. He holds 3,000 years of memory in his living mind, and his house holds the physical records of much of the rest. It is a place where questions can be answered, where broken things, including broken people, can be mended, and Elrond himself is one of the great unsung heroes of Tolkien's world, quiet in his importance, steady across the ages. His daughter Arwen, the Evenstar, called Undomiel, is perhaps the most beautiful being of the Third Age, as Luthien had been of the First. She is Luthien reborn in later time, a living echo of that older beauty, and her story mirrors Luthien's in the most profound way, for she too will choose mortality for the sake of a mortal man, will give up immortality and the life of the elves for love. That man is Aragorn, heir of Isildur, and we will come to them in time. But know that Arwen is there in Rivendell through much of the Third Age, silver-voiced and deep of thought, carrying within herself the old blood of Beren and Luthien, of Elrond and Celebrian, of the high lineages of both elves and men. Lothlorien, the Golden Wood, is something entirely different from Rivendell. Where Rivendell is warm and full of the bustle of lore and visitors and the practical business of a refuge, Lothlorien is still. It is perhaps the most purely magical place remaining in Middle-earth in the Third Age, because the Ring of Nenya that Galadriel bears maintains it in a state of preservation so complete that time seems to move differently there. The great Malern trees, silver-barked, with leaves that turn gold and do not fall until spring, grow in Lothlorien and nowhere else in Middle-earth, transplanted from the west long ago. The elves of Lothlorien live in the branches, in flets built high in the boughs, and the ground below is carpeted with the small white and gold flowers called Elenor and Nifredil that are found nowhere else. The light in Lothlorien has a quality that travelers from outside consistently notice and struggle to describe. It is as if the light itself is older there, deeper, as if you have stepped sideways into an earlier time. Galadriel rules Lothlorien with Celeborn, and she is perhaps the most powerful being in Middle-earth in the Third Age. More powerful perhaps than any other elvish lord remaining, for her lineage is extraordinary. She is granddaughter of Finwë, one of the original 3 ambassadors to Valinor, and was born in Valinor under the light of the trees, and her experience spans all 3 ages. She was in Valinor before the 2 trees were destroyed. She was in Beleriand. She lived through the Second Age and the Last Alliance, and in all those thousands of years she has grown in wisdom and power until she is something nearly without precedent, an elf who has not forgotten the deep lore of Valinor, and has also accumulated all the wisdom of the long ages of exile. Her mirror is a basin of water in which visions appear, past, present, possible future. And even that artifact is astonishing, a thing she has made herself with the power she carries. Sauron feared her. Even Gandalf, in his elvish adjacent wisdom, treated her with great respect, and she carries within her always the shadow of her original choice. She left Valinor in the rebellious pride of the First Age, and she has never been permitted to return. The doom of the Noldor is on her too, even if more gently than on most, and so Lothlorien is maintained partly by an ache, a longing, the longing of one who can see the western sky every evening and know what lies beyond it and cannot go. Thranduil's woodland realm in Mirkwood is different again. It is a Sindarin kingdom, not Noldorin, less burdened by the grandeur and the curse of the Noldor's history, more rooted in the immediate world of trees and seasons and the practical business of keeping the darkness of the forest at bay. Mirkwood, once called Greenwood the Great before the shadow of Dol Guldur settled in its southern reaches, became steadily darker through the Third Age as Sauron's power grew. The great spiders crept in from the east, kin of Shelob, and the forest paths became dangerous, and the wood elves became more insular, more cautious, less inclined to welcome strangers. Thranduil's halls were carved into the living rock of a cliff, and the river that ran beneath them was the only way in and out, and the gates were kept. His son Legolas is the most active elvish figure of the War of the Ring from this kingdom, and he brings to the Fellowship a lightness and a directness that is perhaps the character of these less history-burdened elves, not carrying the weight of the exile and the Silmarils and the long centuries of guilt and longing, but simply being what he is, a wood elf, a warrior, a friend. The Third Age is full of the accumulated weight of all those previous ages. The elves who remain in Middle-earth are all shaped by that weight. They have a melancholy that is not unhappiness exactly, or rather, it is a particular kind of sadness that coexists with great joy, a bittersweet quality that comes from loving things so deeply while knowing that all things pass. They can be joyful, the songs in Rivendell's Hall of Fire, the dancing in Lothlorien's glades, the laughter of the wood elves, but underneath any moment of elvish joy, if you listen closely, there is always the awareness of endings. The sea longing is real and important in understanding the Third Age elves. Those elves who saw the sea or heard the cry of gulls were often overcome by an ache for the west, for Valinor, for the ships that could carry them there. The elves call it the sea longing or the yearning. The Noldor might call it simply the call, the pull toward the undying lands that grew stronger as Middle-earth's age drew toward its close. Many elves had already sailed west across the Third Age. Círdan at the Grey Havens maintained the ships and the harbor, welcoming those who came to sail, presiding over the slow, steady departure of the elvish people from Middle-earth. Círdan himself is one of the most ancient and least celebrated figures in Tolkien's world. He is Telerin, one of those sea-loving elves of the Third Kindred, and he has been at the western shore of Middle-earth since before the First Age, since before even the great crossing to Valinor. He tried to sail west with Elwë once, in the very earliest days, and was told by a vision to stay, that a need for him remained in Middle-earth, and he stayed and stayed and stayed across all 3 ages, tending the havens, building ships, watching elves sail away, and remaining himself. He was given Narya, the Ring of Fire, by Celebrimbor originally, and when Gandalf arrived in Middle-earth with the other wizards, Círdan gave Narya to Gandalf, sensing that the wizard would need it more than he. It is a remarkable act, to give away the greatest ring entrusted to you because someone else needs it more. That is the character of Círdan. The Third Age also sees the gradual diminishment of the elvish presence in Middle-earth in smaller, quieter ways. Not just the great sailings westward, but the drawing back of elvish populations from many areas, the retreat into the remaining safe havens, the sense of a people preparing for a final departure rather than a permanent dwelling. Even the lands they hold, Lothlorien, Rivendell, are maintained against this trend by the power of the 3 rings, and everyone knows that if Sauron should ever regain the One Ring, all that the 3 rings have preserved would dissolve. It is a precarious beauty. And then came the War of the Ring. Sauron's long search for the One Ring had been ongoing since his return to power in the Third Age. He had first come back subtly, establishing himself in the southern reaches of Mirkwood, in the fortress called Dol Guldur, and for centuries centuries, the other powers of Middle-earth debated whether the evil there was Sauron, or merely some lesser darkness. Gandalf eventually confirmed the truth. He went into Dol Guldur in disguise and found Sauron, and brought back word to the White Council. And the White Council, Gandalf, Saruman, Galadriel, Elrond, and others, drove Sauron from Dol Guldur, but it was too late, or rather it was only a postponement. Sauron returned openly to Mordor and made his final push for the ring. The story of the War of the Ring, as it centers on the elves, is a story of several interlocking threads, none of them more important than the others. There is the Council of Elrond at Rivendell, where the fate of the ring was decided, that great gathering of representatives of all the free peoples, where Elrond presided and the decision was made to destroy the ring in the fires of Mount Doom. There is Lothlorien, where the Fellowship rested after Gandalf's fall in Moria, and where Galadriel gave gifts and gave Frodo her mirror, and where the great temptation was offered and refused. There is Mirkwood and the Woodland Realm, from which Legolas came to join the Fellowship. And there is the larger question of what would happen to the Elvish realms and the three rings if the one ring were destroyed. Let me linger a moment on the Council of Elrond, because it is in some ways the culmination of all the long history we have been telling. Elrond presides, and Boromir, and Legolas, and Gimli, and Aragorn, and Gandalf and Frodo, and the other hobbits are all there, and they speak of all the history we have been telling, of Isildur's failure, of the ring's nature, of Sauron's power, and Elrond, who was at the last alliance, who watched Isildur take the ring from Sauron's finger, who pleaded with Isildur then to cast it in the fire, and was refused. Elrond carries the weight of that ancient moment. He has waited 3,000 years for the problem to return and be finally resolved, and now it is before him again, and he makes the decision that defines what remains of the Third Age. Galadriel's refusal of the ring deserves a special attention. When Frodo, in a moment of despair and generosity both, offered Galadriel the ring, offered it to her freely, which is the only way a ring of power can truly be given, she underwent a visible transformation. She grew tall, terrible, beautiful beyond bearing, a queen of ancient power and light and shadow both. And she spoke of what she would do with such power, what great and terrible deeds she would perform, how she would set right all wrongs and make the world bend to her justice. And then she let the vision fall and return to herself, smaller and softer and achingly real, and she said, "I pass the test. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." This is one of the most extraordinary moments in all of Tolkien, and in the context of the complete history of the elves, it carries all its weight. Galadriel, who left Valinor in the pride of the Noldor, who swore she would carve a realm for herself in Middle-earth and never bow to any power greater than herself, who has carried within herself for 6,000 years the ambition that the ring would so perfectly serve. She refuses it. She has learned, in all those thousands of years, that the desire to do good and the possession of absolute power are not sufficient protection against corruption. She has watched Morgoth and Sauron and the sons of Feanor demonstrate that truth again and again. She has perhaps suspected it in herself, and so she refuses, and she will diminish. It is the most mature choice in the mythology, the choice of someone who has lived long enough to know that wisdom sometimes means accepting less power, not more. The battle for Middle-earth was also fought in the Elvish lands. Lothlorien was attacked 3 times during the War of the Ring by armies from Dol Guldur, while the Fellowship was making its way south, while Frodo was crossing Mordor, while Aragorn was fighting before the Black Gate. 3 times the armies of Sauron came against the Golden Wood, and 3 times the power of Nenya and the valor of the Elves of Lothlorien drove them back. And Thranduil's woodland realm was also attacked from the east, the forces of darkness pressing against the forest, and the Elves of Rivendell sent sons into the battle, Eladan and Elrohir, the twin sons of Elrond, who rode with the rangers of the north and were with Aragorn as he went through the paths of the dead. These are Elrond's children, half-elven, who had not yet made their choice of kindred and would choose only after the war was won. And then the ring was destroyed. In the fires of Mount Doom, when Gollum bit the ring from Frodo's finger and fell in a moment of terrible, redemptive clumsiness into the crack of doom. In that moment, the One Ring was unmade, and everything built on the power of the One Ring came apart. Sauron's tower of Barad-dûr fell, his army before the Black Gate dissolved, his presence in the world, that terrible eye, flickered out, and the three rings of the elves lost their power. This is the bittersweet truth at the heart of the victory. The free peoples had won, but for the elves, winning meant losing as well. The power that had maintained Lothlorien, that had kept its trees golden, and its time slow, and its beauty intact, that power was gone. The power that had maintained Rivendell's warmth and wisdom and depth of feeling, that was fading too. The preservation that the three rings had offered was over, and without it the natural course of things would resume. The elvish places would change. The trees would be ordinary trees again. The light would be ordinary light. The beauty would be not gone, but mortal, subject to time, no longer held in that miraculous stasis. It is a victory that costs everything for those who had the most to lose. The men of Gondor and Rohan, the hobbits, the dwarves, they gain a world freed from Sauron's shadow. The elves gain the same world and watch their last beautiful things in it begin to change and know that what they have preserved is now truly passing. Breathe slowly now, dear traveler. Let the weight of that understanding settle gently, the way snow settles, slowly, quietly, changing everything by degrees. After the War of the Ring, the departure began in earnest. Galadriel sailed. The Lady of Lothlorien, who had been in Middle-earth since the beginning of the First Age, who had seen more of the world's history than almost any other living being, sailed from the Grey Havens at the end of the Third Age. Celeborn remained for a time, for Celeborn was less eager to leave, more rooted in the land, but eventually he too would sail. Elrond sailed, the great lord of Rivendell, the keeper of memory, the lord of the last homely house, whose ring had preserved his valley and whose wisdom had shaped so many of the great decisions of the Third Age. He sailed, and with him went Gandalf, for Gandalf too was one of the divine powers returning to the West now that his work was done, and Bilbo Baggins, old and small and peaceful, who had carried the ring in unknowing innocence and deserved the mercy of a rest he could not find in mortal lands. And Frodo sailed, Frodo Baggins, ring-bearer, who had carried the One Ring into Mordor, who had been scarred by it in ways that did not heal and would not heal. He was given the gift that had never before been given to a mortal, or almost never. He was invited to go to the Undying Lands, to the island of Tol Eressëa, to rest in the West. This is the grace of the Valar extended across the final boundary, offered to one who had borne the greatest burden, and he went. And Samwise Gamgee, they say, eventually followed him, decades later, after his own long life was done and his wife had passed, and he was ready. For Sam, too, had been a ring-bearer, briefly, and the same mercy may have been extended. The Grey Havens scene is perhaps the most quietly devastating thing in all of Tolkien's work. Frodo and Gandalf and Galadriel and Elrond and Bilbo at the harbour, in the autumn evening light, the ship white and ready, the air smelling of salt and the end of things, and Sam and Merry and Pippin standing on the shore, watching the ship pull away into the west, into the last of the day's light until it was gone, and then they turned and rowed home through the dark, and the world went on without that particular kind of magic in it. Legolas stayed for a time. He had been the elf of the Fellowship, the wood elf from Mirkwood, bright-eyed and light-footed and beloved. He stayed in Ithilien, the eastern land of Gondor that he helped to tend and restore, bringing elves with him to live in the woods and make them beautiful again. But the sea longing had been kindled in him, kindled when the Fellowship was in Gondor, when he heard the cry of gulls for the first time, and something broke open in him that could never be quite closed again. He endured it for years, tending the forests of Ithilien with his friends. But after Aragorn died, after his dearest companion of the War of the Ring was gone, after Gimli the dwarf had also grown old, Legolas built a ship, and he and Gimli together sailed from the mouths of the Anduin for the Undying Lands. Gimli sailed with him, which is perhaps unique in all the history of the world, a dwarf in the Elvish West, a mercy shown to one who had loved Galadriel and Middle-earth, and elvish kind with the uncomplicated, wholehearted devotion that moved even the Valar. And so, dear traveler, the elves of Middle-earth are gone. Not gone in the sense of destruction, not like Beleriand beneath the waves, not like the burning of the ships at the Firth of Drengist, gone in the sense of departure, of the tide going out, of the last candle being carried into the next room. The elves live still in Valinor and on Tol Eressëa, in the blessed realm beyond the sea. They are immortal, and they continue. But they are no longer in Middle-earth, and Middle-earth is poorer for their absence in ways that cannot entirely be articulated, only felt in the moments when a piece of very old music touches something in you that you cannot name, or when the light on a forest floor in autumn makes you inexplicably sad, or when you hear a language you have never spoken and feel that it is beautiful in a way that goes beyond anything you can explain. But the story of the elves as a civilization, the great arc of it, from waking at Cuiviénen to the last ships leaving the Grey Havens, deserves one more pass through its deepest themes, because a history told only as events is only half a history. What were the elves? Not just in the sense of what they did, but in the sense of what they were, as beings, as a people. They were beings of deep memory. Memory is the foundation of elvish character, in a way it can never be for mortals. An elf does not forget, not in the way a man forgets, where memories fade and blur, and eventually the face of someone beloved becomes unclear, where the pain of old grief softens to a manageable ache. An elf who loved someone 3,000 years ago loves them with the same sharpness now. An elf who witnessed a great beauty 10,000 years ago can recall it in such completeness that recalling it is almost the same as seeing it again. This is extraordinary. It is also in many ways a burden, because loss does not fade, because grief does not soften, because the weight of all those thousands of years of memory is always present, and it can become unbearable. This is why the elves fade. This is the truth behind the decline that Tolkien depicts. Not that the elves are being destroyed, or even that they are simply leaving. It is that Middle-earth is changing, and they cannot change with it, because they are what they always were, and what they were was shaped by moments that are now thousands of years in the past. The world moves forward, but elvish identity is rooted in moments that are gone, and eventually the only honest thing to do is to go west, to the place where their nature can be sustained, to rest. They were beings of great craft and love of beauty. We have seen this in every age: the Tengwar of Feanor, the Silmarils, the Rings of Power, the cities of Gondolin and Nargothrond, the Malon trees of Lothlorien, the ships of the Teleri. The elvish love of craft is not the same as the dwarven love of craft. The dwarves make things to possess them, to accumulate them, to stack them in the depths of the earth. The elves make things to love them, and then to love the world that holds them. Their making is an act of devotion to the physical world, an attempt to bring out the latent beauty in wood and stone and metal and thread, to make the world more truly what it is already trying to be. They were beings of song. This might seem like a small thing, but it is not. Song for the elves is not performance, not entertainment in the modern sense. Song is the way they understand the world, because the world itself was made through a song, the music of the Ainur. And to sing is, in some deep sense, to participate in the act of creation, to add your voice to the original creative act, to continue the work. Elvish song can carry enchantment. Elvish song can preserve memory, can heal wounds, can call up visions. The contest of songs between Finrod and Sauron in the dungeons of Tol Garhoth is not a metaphor. It is a literal battle of wills expressed through music. Lúthien's song before Morgoth is not a distraction while she sneaks up on him. It is a weapon of power. They were beings of love, deep, permanent, specific love. Elvish love, once given, does not change. An elf marries once for eternity. An elf who loses a spouse may die of grief, as Miriel died giving birth to Feanor, as Finwë was willing to accept death rather than the alternative the Valar offered. The love that Beren and Lúthien had for each other was so absolute that it changed the rules of the universe, moved Mandos to weep, moved Ilúvatar to offer an unprecedented choice. The love of Tur and Idril endured across the ruin of Gondolin and found peace in the west. The love of Elrond and Celebrian endured through centuries of separation when Celebrian was wounded by orcs and passed to Valinor before Elrond could follow. And Arwen's love for Aragorn echoes the love of Luthien for Beren in the most deliberate and heartbreaking way. The same choice, the same sacrifice, the same willingness to give up everything that elvish nature promises in exchange for a mortal life with the one she loved. They were beings in tension with time. This is perhaps their most essential quality, immortal but not unchanging, rooted in the past but living in the present, capable of growth and development across vast stretches of time, but also capable of getting stuck, of becoming prisoners of their own depth. Galadriel grew through 6,000 years into the being we meet in The Lord of the Rings. The Elves of Mirkwood grew more isolationist and suspicious across the Third Age as their forest darkened. The sons of Feanor were unable to grow past the moment of the oath, unable to release themselves from its compulsion, even as it destroyed them. Time is different for elves. They do not race against it. They must learn to walk with it in a longer, slower dance than any mortal can imagine, and they were beings with a specific role in the great plan of things. The firstborn, the ones who came before men, the ones who shaped the world's first history and left their mark on everything that followed. Every human language has some distant elvish root, according to Tolkien's scheme, because the elves were the first to speak, and the speech of men developed partly from contact with elvish tongues. Every human art has some distant echo of what the elves first did. The first songs, the first written letters, the first deliberate beauty made and shared. The elves are, in this mythology, the ancestors of human culture in a deep and non-literal sense. They represent what humanity might be if it had more time, more depth, more completeness, and their fading is the loss of that deeper version. The world continues without them is perhaps richer in some ways for the energy and adaptability that mortals bring, but is also quieter and less. Let me tell you, dear traveler, of what has always struck me most in this long history. It is not the great battles, though those are magnificent and terrible. It is not the greatest names, Feanor and Luthien and Elrond and Galadriel, though they are unforgettable. It is the smaller moments of continuity across the ages, the threads that run unbroken from the shores of Cuiviénen to the Grey Havens, the language, Quenya and Sindarin, those living languages that the elves spoke across all three ages, that evolved and changed as all living languages do, but remained always recognizably the same in their beauty, the same vowels that the first elves spoke by the still water of Cuiviénen, echoing in the words of Tolkien's inscriptions, the names that carry meaning: Tinuviel, Nightingale, Calaquendi, Elves of the Light, Gil-galad, Star of Bright Radiance, Elisar, the Elfstone. Every name a small poem, every word a window into the people who made it. The devotion to Vada, to Elbereth. The elves call her by various names: Elbereth, Gilthoniel, the Star Kindler, and she is perhaps the divine power they love most, the one whose stars they saw first when they opened their eyes at Cuiviénen, the one whose name in Sindarin has the power of prayer. When Frodo was stabbed by a Morgul blade and crawling toward Rivendell in despair and darkness, it was the name of Elbereth on his lips that gave him the strength to go on. When Sam confronted Shelob with the phial of Galadriel, it was the ancient elvish words of Elbereth's praise that came out of him, unbidden, a prayer learned perhaps without fully understanding its source. The devotion of the elves to the Star Kindler is something that crosses even from their world into the hearts of those who have only touched their world at its edges. The ring of Barahir, that ring that Finrod gave to Barahir, a ring shaped like two serpents with eyes of emerald, whose heads met beneath a crown of flowers made in gold. It passed from Barahir to Beren, and was carried with the Silmaril out of Doriath, and was handed down through the line of Elros, through the kings of Númenor, through the faithful who escaped the drowning, through the wandering kings of Arnor, through the rangers who kept the remnant of Arnor's line alive in the long centuries when they were forgotten by the world, until it came to Aragorn, and Aragorn gave it to Arwen, as his troth pledge, a single physical object, a small circle of gold and silver, with those two serpents passing from hand to hand across 6,000 years of history, from the brightest age of the elves to the age when the last elvish realm was departing. It is almost too much to contain, and the bloodlines. Tolkien's world is one in which bloodlines carry something real, not in a crude or superstitious way, but in the sense that the character and capacity of ancestors is genuinely present in their descendants. Arwen carries the beauty and the grace of Luthien across 60 generations of descent. Aragorn carries the kingship and the long sight and the healing touch of Númenórean nobility, which came from Elros, which came from Erendil, which came from Tuor and Idril, and from Beren and Luthien. The line from the First Age to the end of the Third Age is unbroken, in both elvish and human form, a continuous thread of inheritance that makes Aragorn's coronation in Gondor not just a political event, but the culmination of a bloodline that began at Cuiviénen and was shaped by the greatest stories the world has ever held. There is also, in the history of the elves, a lesson about the relationship between love and loss, and how the depth of one creates the depth of the other. The elves loved deeply, made beautiful things, built kingdoms of surpassing grace, and everything they made and loved was eventually lost. Beleriand drowned, Doriath burned, Gondolin fell, Eregion was sacked, and every loss was felt with full elvish intensity, without the softening that mortality provides. Because an elf does not forget and does not have the gift of a final end that puts all pain in perspective. The elvish sadness that runs through everything, that quality Tolkien called the beauty of lamentation, the sense that the most beautiful things are beautiful, in part because of their passing, is inseparable from the depth of elvish love. They love so much that their losses are enormous, and they keep loving because what else is there to do? There is a particular kind of elvish wisdom that emerges from this, that you can see in Elrond and Galadriel especially. It is the wisdom of people who have failed and survived the failure. Galadriel was there for the kinslaying at Alqualonda, present if not directly complicit. She was part of the host that left Valinor in pride and defiance. She was there for the long, terrible arc of the First Age's ending. She was there when the rings were made and when the deception was revealed. She made mistakes, had a hand in disasters, chose wrongly at times, as anyone does over 6,000 years. And what she learned from all of that is the wisdom she brings to the council of the wise in the Third Age. A wisdom that is not distant or cold or falsely serene, but warm and watchful and deeply honest about the nature of power and the uses of caution. Elrond's wisdom is of a different kind, more archival, more rooted in the accumulated knowledge of all those ages, more given to analysis and long perspective. He is the one who can say, of a sword, this is Narsil, the sword of Elendil, broken at the Battle of Dagorlad, and know not just the name but the event, because he was there. He can see Aragorn and know who he is, because he knew Isildur and knew the line, and followed it through all the generations of the Rangers of the North. He is living history in the most literal possible sense, and his wisdom is the wisdom of someone who has seen enough to know what patterns repeat, what errors are made over and over again, what choices change everything, and what apparent catastrophes are merely moments in a longer story. Both kinds of wisdom were necessary for the world of the Third Age, and both will be missed once the ships have sailed. Let the story settle now, dear listener. Let it be with you without requiring anything from you. You do not need to remember all the names, all the events, all the centuries. The shape of it is enough. The great arc from waking to departing, from first opening of eyes in starlit darkness to the last ship sailing into the western light, from the innocent wonder of Cuiviénen to the earned wisdom of the Grey Havens, from the pride of the Noldor burning ships on a northern shore to the humility of Galadriel saying, I will diminish and remain Galadriel, from the first words spoken by the first elf at the water's edge to the last song heard in Rivendell before the halls fell quiet. The elvish legacy in Middle-earth is not in physical things, because the physical things are mostly gone, Beleriand drowned, Gondolin ash, Eregion ruined, the rings of power unmade or taken west. It is in the shapes that memory makes. It is in the languages that men who came after the elves would still use echoes of, without knowing quite why they felt beautiful. It is in the names on old maps, the names the elves gave to rivers and mountains and forests, many of which persisted into the age of men because they were simply the right names, the truest names, the ones that fit. It is in the stories themselves, Beren and Luthien, the fall of Gondolin, the voyage of Eärendil, which survived in the traditions of men as the oldest and most beautiful things that anyone could remember, older than any human kingdom, older than any human language in its current form, going back to the age before the sun. And it is in the stars. The elves are the children of starlight, the Calaquendi and the Moriquendi, the ones who woke beneath the stars and loved them first, and named them first, and devoted their deepest love to the queen who kindled them. And the stars are still there, in our sky, and in the sky of Tolkien's world, unchanged across all 3 ages and beyond. Eärendil, the evening star, sails across the heavens with the Silmaril on his brow, carrying the last remnant of the light of the 2 trees before the 2 trees were destroyed. And every evening, if you look west, just after the sun has gone, and the first stars are coming out, you can find that bright point of light, Venus, or whatever your cosmology calls it, and know that in the story of Middle-earth it carries the most ancient and most hopeful light remaining in the world. The elves sang to the stars, and the stars were their first memory, and the stars will outlast them, and will outlast us, and will be there when whatever comes next opens its eyes for the first time, and looks up and begins to wonder and begins to name. And so, dear traveler, we have walked the complete history of the Elves of Middle-earth from the very first moment to the very last departure. We have been at Cuiviénen when the first eyes opened under the new stars. We have walked the long roads of the great journey westward and stood at the shores of the sundering sea. We have seen the light of the 2 trees in Valinor and felt the darkness that came when they were destroyed. We have watched the Noldor sail in pride and cross the grinding ice in grief. We have built Gondolin stone by stone in the hidden valley and seen it fall in a single terrible night. We have followed Beren and Luthien into the heart of Angband and back out again. We have stood in Lothlorien and felt the quality of its particular light, golden and old and preserved. We have watched Galadriel refuse the ring and choose to diminish, and we have seen the last ships sail from the grey havens into the western evening. It has been a long journey, and you have come with me the whole way, dear traveler, breathing slowly in the quiet of your night, letting these ancient stories move through you. I want you to know how grateful I am for your company on this journey. These stories deserve to be heard and held in the quiet mind, and you have given them that tonight. Now let the last echoes of this history fade softly, like a song ending. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Feel your breath, slow and even. The world of Middle-earth is very far away now, and very peaceful, and what remains of the elves' time there was beautiful, worth every grief, worth every loss, worth all the long ages of longing and departure, because they were there, and they were beautiful, and they loved the world with everything they had. The stars outside your window, if you can see them, are the same stars that were there when the first elves opened their eyes. Not literally the same. The sky turns over long centuries, and the light from those stars is ancient. But the sky is the same sky. The darkness between the stars is the same darkness. And in that darkness there is the same possibility there always was, of something waking, of something looking up, of something beginning to wonder. Let yourself rest now. Let the voice of this story become something very quiet, something that recedes like the sound of a river when you move away from it, still present, still beautiful, but not requiring your attention. Your body is heavy with the good weight of rest. Your mind is quieter than it was when we started. Let the images drift as they will. The silver water of Cuiviénen, the golden light of Lothlorien, the white ships at the grey havens, the evening star over the western sea. Let this story carry you, dear traveller, all the way down into the deepest, most restful sleep. You have earned it. You have gone far tonight, and you are safe now, and the world is quiet, and the stars are doing their slow work overhead, and there is nothing that needs to be done or remembered or resolved until a much later hour. And so, dear traveller, as you rest and let the weight of these ancient stories fade gently into the night, may the echoes of the Elves of Middle-earth, their beauty and their grief and their undimmed love for the world, guide you into the soundest and most peaceful of sleeps. May your dreams be filled with starlight and the sound of rivers, with golden light through silver trees, with the feeling of ancient music that you somehow already know. Good night, dear traveller, good night. May your rest be deep and gentle and full of peace. The story is told, and the stars are above us, and all is well. Good night.